Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Judith Horstman, the president of the Bay Area Travel Writers Association, and we are delighted to partner with Book Passage to present a conversation with the renowned travel writer and editor, Don George. For more than 4 decades, Don has traveled the globe, writing and visiting about faraway places and the people who live there. Most of us know Don from the annual Book Passage Travel Writers and Photographers Conference that he co-founded and he chairs every year, or from his many articles and books, including the best-selling How to Be a Travel Writer. Don has also edited 10 award-winning literary travel anthologies and is the co-founder of the San Francisco-based literary reading series, Weekday Wonderlust. He teaches workshops and he leads international tours. But Don says those of us in the Bay Area probably know him best as the one-time travel editor at the San Francisco Examiner and Chronicle, who published articles by many of the local writers before moving on to Salon, Lonely Planet, and now with National Geographic. Don, it's so great to see you again.
Great to see you, Judith. Thank you very much for hosting this event tonight. I'm honored and thrilled.
It's always great to speak with you. So you didn't plan to be a travel writer. How did it happen?
No, I didn't plan to be a travel writer. I planned to be a poet, which is an eminently practical way to make a living, I thought. As an undergraduate, really in high school, I began writing poetry and it just somehow really appealed to me. And as an undergraduate at Princeton, I majored in English and comparative literature, but I kind of minored in creative writing, and I took poetry writing classes, and I thought that I would be a poet. But then one thing led to another, and I ended up, I went to school in master's degree in creative writing, and I wrote a book of poetry for that as my thesis. But then along the way, I wrote a travel article that got published, and I suddenly thought maybe I should be doing travel writing since all my poems were not getting published and my one travel article was. Perhaps that would be the way to go. And so I ended up being a travel writer. I mean, there's a really, really long story behind all of the serendipities and craziness that led to my actually being hired as a travel writer. But in brief, I thought I'd be a poet. I wrote one travel article that got published, and suddenly I thought maybe I should try this. And serendipity guided me to exactly the right person at exactly the right time. And suddenly I was a travel writer.
I think the story of how you got published for the first time is fascinating. If I could just speak for you for a moment, you took a creative writing course and you wrote an assignment. And the assignment was a homework assignment. It was about climbing Kilimanjaro.
Right. So I'd climbed Kilimanjaro this summer. And when I graduated from Princeton, I went to France and Greece for a year. And then I decided to go to graduate school in creative writing. And that freed me up to go to Africa for the summer. And quite spontaneously, I was on a safari with another friend of mine and 3 of my students from Athens and their parents. And Mount Kilimanjaro appeared in the distance. The clouds cleared and there it was. And my friend John said, "Look, it's Mount Kilimanjaro. It would be really amazing to climb that." And I said, "Yeah, that's a great idea." And then suddenly, 4 days later, we were at the Marangu Hotel in Arusha, getting ready to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, something we had not planned to do when we went to Africa. So we made an impromptu climb of Mount Kilimanjaro. And then I went to graduate school in creative writing, majoring in poetry, but I took a nonfiction writing class. And the assignment was to write an article, a nonfiction article. And I thought, well, I guess I'll write about climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. That was a pretty amazing experience. So I wrote that article. I graduated from graduate school, got my master's in creative writing, won a fellowship to go to Japan, a Princeton in Asia fellowship to teach for 2 years in Japan. Before I went to Japan, I thought it would be smart for me to contact some editors in New York and offer to be their foreign correspondent in Tokyo. So I wrote to the New Yorker and the Atlantic and Harper's and all these places that were dying to have a 21-year-old foreign correspondent in Tokyo. And I also wrote to Mademoiselle magazine because I knew them from a competition during my undergraduate time at Princeton. And some of the editors said, well, we don't really need any correspondence in Tokyo. We have Pulitzer Prize winners in Tokyo. Thank you very much for offering, young man. But if you're going to be in New York before you go, we'd be happy to meet with you. So I was living in Connecticut at the time. So I could easily get to New York. And I met actually with a number of editors, but one of the editors I got to meet with was the travel editor at Mademoiselle. And I brought my homework assignment about climbing Kilimanjaro with me as a writing sample. And I handed it to her at the end of our meeting. And I said, this is just an example of my writing. And I just thought I'd drop it off with you. And so you had something to see what I could do. And then I went back to Connecticut, and then I went to Japan. I went to Tokyo. And when I got to my apartment on the campus at the university where I was teaching, there was a telegram waiting for me from the travel editor at Mademoiselle. And it said, a hole opened up in our November issue, and we put your Kilimanjaro story in it. Hope you don't mind. So I didn't mind. And that was my first published travel article.
And you were 23 years old.
Yep.
And just one of a whole bunch of serendipities that have followed your professional and personal career. So when you were in Japan, I think you met someone who would become your future wife.
I did indeed. I was teaching on a 2-year fellowship at International Christian University in Tokyo. And during those 2 years, I met a very wonderful woman, Kuniko Ninomiya. We started dating and became more serious. And I visited her family on her home island of Shikoku, which I also fell in love with. And we were dating in Japan. We ended up coming back to the States together for a year. She did a year abroad in the US in 1979. And so we ended up, eventually we got married in 1982 in the US, and then again in Japan. We had 2 weddings.
Yep. I always like to think it's so interesting. You got married twice to the same woman.
Right, exactly. We wanted to get as many of the gods blessing us as possible. So we did a congregational church ceremony at Berkeley, at the beautiful First Congregational Church in Berkeley. When I grew up, as I was growing up, I went to Congregational Church in Connecticut. And then we went to Japan, and we had a traditional Shinto ceremony in Kuniko's hometown, which was really, really wonderful. So we got married twice.
And you got married the second time in the complete regalia too.
Yes.
So then
yes.
you're back in the US, you're at Berkeley, and you're all set to take a teaching job at what? San Francisco University?
Right, exactly. So I'd been hired to be a teacher of English as a second language, a TESOL teacher, because that's what I'd been doing in Tokyo. So it seemed like something I could do. And quite astonishingly, I had written an article about Japan, and I had sent it to the great travel editor at the San Francisco Examiner, Georgia Hess, the legendary Georgia Hess. And I have to back up a little bit, because before that, incredibly serendipitously, I got invited to go on a press trip to Japan, quite luckily. I went on that press trip. I met someone on that press trip, a wonderful travel writer named Shirley Faulkner, based in the Bay Area. We came back. I was getting ready to start teaching. I called up the Examiner and just to ask what the status of the article I'd submitted was. And of course, I expected to get some low-level person who would pass me on to an answering machine or something, but the phone was picked up by Georgia Hess. She said, "Hello, Georgia Hess." And I kind of fainted. I wasn't expecting to speak to Georgia Hess. I said, Ms. Hess, my name is Don George. You don't know me, but I submitted an article on Kyushu in Japan, and I was just wondering what the status of the article is. And she said, "Mr. George, I have no idea what the status of your article is, but I'd really like to meet you. I'm just talking with someone about you." And it turned out that Georgia was planning to take a 1-year leave of absence from the paper. And she had called up Shirley Faulkner and said, "Shirley, I'm planning to leave for a year. Would you like to take my place while I'm gone?" And Shirley said, "I can't. I just met this nice young man on a press trip to Japan who just moved to the Bay Area, and he might be perfect for the job." And then I called. So that was incredibly serendipitous. And she said, "I'd like to meet you." And I said, "Oh, I'd love to meet you." And I went down to the Examiner and talked to her a few times. And then she approved of me. And I ended up talking to the publisher and the editor-in-chief and the the janitor and the night watchman and pretty much everybody at the Examiner. And they ended up deciding to hire me to take her place for a year as a travel writer. So that really was how I got my start as a travel writer, was taking Georgia Hess's place for a year while she took a leave of absence. And it totally changed my life.
It did. It was your second big serendipity. So you were editing at the time, but you also did a lot of traveling. You've been to 90 countries on 5 continents. And I think we'd love to hear some stories about your travels, for example, like your best experiences, your worst experiences.
Let's see, there's a lot of best experiences.
In a thumbnail.
I guess one of the first ones was just going back to Paris. Living in Paris as a post-Princeton graduate really changed my life also. I think that's where the seed of being a travel writer was planted, because there was a moment there in Paris during that summer when I remember I took the elevator from my apartment. I was living on the Rue de Rivoli. I went down to the Rue de Rivoli, stepped out into the vibrant, amazing streets of Paris, and I just stopped and realized that France was all around me. I mean, people were speaking French, wearing French, smelling French. They were standing at the cafe, drinking their cafe crèmes, and they were ordering the Nouvel Observateur and Le Monde. And it was just France. And I had this moment when I thought I could go back to the United States and go to graduate school, which I was thinking I would probably do, and become a Tweedy professor and spend all my days in ivy-shadowed halls, musty, fusty halls. Or, and I looked around me, I could study in the classroom of the world. And I thought, I think I like the classroom of the world. So as my first assignment for myself, after I became the travel editor at the paper, I sent myself back to Paris. And that was a really glorious return. Just amazing immersion back in France and celebrating French history and culture. So that was a super memorable way to start my journeys. But one of the trips that lives with me the most is probably a great adventure I took up the Karakoram Highway in Pakistan to Hunza. I'd heard all about Hunza, legendary Hunza. And so I wanted to do it. And it turned out that a company called Inner Asia, which was based in San Francisco, had a great trip to Hunza. And so I took that trip. We went up the Karakoram Highway. A lot of things went wrong. This is adventure travel. A lot of things went wrong. Even the best, we were staying in the best hotels, but they didn't have hot water. The water wouldn't work. The food was not much to write home about. It was cold, unseasonably cold. It was gray, it was rainy. We were surrounded by the Karakoram. We couldn't see anything. So there was a lot that went wrong, and yet it was an incredibly exhilarating adventure all the same. We had, the Karakoram kept getting washed out. There kept being avalanches. There was one moment when our bus got stuck between 2 avalanches. And the guide said, well, we'll just sit here and we'll wait for, we'll get a Jeep to come on the other side of the avalanche, and eventually we'll walk over the avalanche and the Jeep will take us to the hotel. And I said, I'm not going to sit here waiting for an avalanche to engulf us. So I got out and I walked over the avalanche, and I got back on the Karakoram Highway and I walked to the hotel. So I was alone on the Karakoram Highway, just me and Marco Polo, walking, listening to the scrunch of my footsteps, looking up at these incredible mountains and feeling as small as I'd ever felt in my life, and realizing kind of my mortality, and at the same time how exhilarating it was to have this adventure in Pakistan. So that was a trip that changed my life in lots of ways. It was a really, really enriching adventure that I'll never forget.
Oh, the glamour of travel writing and the glamour of travel, Don. Yeah. So is it a glamorous career? Is it a glamorous thing to choose to do?
It's not really glamorous. There are definitely moments of glamour. I've stayed in hotel suites that were bigger than my home. And I've had $2,000, $3,000 meals and things like that. And in the moment you think, this is amazing, and also this is a little crazy. So there were moments like that, but the reality of being a travel writer is that it's really, really hard work, and that it's a profession and it's a job, and you do it. And like any work, you have to work really, really, really hard to be successful at it. You have to be lucky. You have to make your own breaks. So it's really a lot of work. And I think people who fancy that it would be fun to be a travel writer imagine somebody sitting on a beach with a wonderful drink with a little paper umbrella in it, and that's their job. And of course, that's not really your job. But I love it. It's been the most amazing career I could have imagined. It's what I ended up dreaming I wanted to do. I didn't know it when I was starting out, but it ended up being my dream career. I've been incredibly enriched, more than I can possibly imagine or summarize, by this job and this life. And so for me, it's the glamour has been in the gritty details, really, the stuff that you don't really talk about or write about, but the amazing things that happen behind the scenes, where you meet people you'll never forget. I get lost all the time. People are incredibly kind to me. They take care of me. I forge friendships that last for decades. All of that is the real glamour. The unglamorous glamour of travel writing is all of those great things that happen, the connections you make, the articles that you get to write where you connect people who may never get to a place with the culture and the country that you've just been to. For me, that's the real glamour of travel writing, is being able to do those things and make those connections. And that has been immeasurably enriching for me.
And the experiences that you've had too. You told me one experience about a dinner in Japan when you ordered sushi.
Right. Right. So this was on a trip where I was exploring the hinterlands of Japan, as I like to do. I've learned enough Japanese that I can get by. And I was way out in the middle of nowhere, and I came into a village, and there was kind of a celebration. There's this foreigner here. Wow, that's crazy. What's the foreigner doing? And I began to talk to people, and I was asking them about their daily life and what's the secret? What's the heart of this village? And at one point, by some consensus, invisible consensus, they decided that I should go to a restaurant and have a very special meal. So I felt like the whole village kind of got behind me and walked me to this one special restaurant. And we went in and sat down, and a few words were exchanged, and someone ran off to the kitchen. And a few minutes later, the whole village was kind of gathered in the restaurant watching. And a few minutes later, a beautiful platter was brought out with a fish elegantly positioned on the platter, kind of in a U shape. It was really beautiful, almost like a work of art. And there it was, and that was the sashimi. And they gave me some sort of ceremonial, elegant chopsticks, and said, "Dozo, this is for you to eat." And I said, "Wow, thank you very much, itadakimasu." And I took my chopsticks and I went and I touched the fish, and it jumped. I went, "Whoa, wait a minute, this wasn't what I was expecting." And I thought, that's just some kind of an odd coincidence that couldn't possibly happen again. So I took my chopsticks and I touched the fish again, and it jumped again. And I thought, oh, okay, I see what's happening here. And I thought, well, I could say, I'm actually quite full. I don't really need to eat anymore. This has been delicious. Or I could just go, my honor is at stake here. The honor of America is at stake here. I kind of have to do what is unthinkable. And I just plunged my chopstick in, and I got a slice of the fish, and I put it in my mouth, and it swam down my throat. And I said, I looked around at everyone and said, oishii, very delicious. And I had a few more bites, and then I felt that I had done my duty to my country and my profession, and said, thank you very much. That was really delicious. But yeah, I'll never forget that moment.
Your profile's in courage as a travel writer.
Really.
And you've had a family now. You have two children who are in their 30s, and you're recently a grandfather, which we'll come back to. Congratulations, joining the Grandparent Club. But you were working before your children were born. Even you were working as a travel writer, and you were traveling 4 or 5 months out of the year.
Right.
And how did you work that out with raising 2 kids and having a wife? I think a lot of people would like to know that.
That's a really good question. It's a total balancing act. You need an extraordinarily kind, generous, understanding family behind you. And when I was home, I tried to live 150% with with my family, with the kids, tried to do everything that they were doing, made sure that I was a part of everything that I could. And then when I was on the road, just checking in, as well as I could. And I think we developed an understanding that this is what I do, and this is my job. This is Dad's job. When the kids were young, we traveled all over the place. We had my daughter Jenny on an airplane as soon as the airline would let her. So they've been traveling ever since they could, and they're great inveterate travelers now. They're amazing travelers now. So I just tried to structure my life in a way that I tried to be home for the really important things in their lives. And when I was home, I tried to be with them, really 150%, so that when I wasn't there, they still felt that I was there with them. And I feel that it worked out. We're incredibly close as a family now, super, super close, which I'm incredibly grateful for. And they have this very wide view of the world. I mean, I think they really are global citizens. And I feel so great about that. I think we all need to be global citizens, and I've raised two. And they inspire me now with the travels that they do and their perspective on the world and on life. That's super inspiring to me.
Yeah, the global citizens. What was the most amazing trip you took with the family? I think you told me, was it Galapagos?
The Galapagos is the one that always stands out. I mean, we had one other trip that we always did, which I'll mention too, just because it was such a cherished pilgrimage. We climbed Half Dome in Yosemite as a family. The first year that my son was old enough to climb, we climbed up Half Dome and made it. And that was really special. And we did that for about 5 summers. Every summer we did that as a cherished family pilgrimage. And that was really amazing. But then the trip to the Galapagos was probably the trip that changed our lives. We all were enraptured with the Galapagos. It's like an otherworldly place where you see how species can relate to each other and interact in a very different way from what we're used to here, where on the rest of the planet, where animals are afraid of us, wildlife is taught to fear humans. On the Galapagos, they really don't. So you'll be walking along a trail and you'll come upon a blue-footed booby, and the blue-footed booby will just kind of look up at you and say, "Hi, welcome to my neighborhood. Just don't mess anything up." And you step over the booby and go on. And this happened countless times. And for my kids, it was like a view of an alternative universe, I think. 2 very special things happened. One was with my daughter, we were walking up a rise. The rest of the group had kind of gotten ahead of us. We got up to the top of a rise. And at the very top of the rise, there was a blue-footed booby in the path sitting on a couple of eggs. And we got to the rise and we looked at the booby, and suddenly right in front of our eyes, one of the eggs cracked open and a little tiny beak emerged. And my daughter and I looked at each other. And my daughter said, "Oh my God, Dad." And I said, "Oh my God, Jenny." It was just this amazing moment of life happening in front of our eyes. It was truly a bonding moment. And then the other one was when Jenny we went snorkeling on a number of days. And there was one day in particular where we went snorkeling with sea lions. And it was as if the sea lions adopted Jenny, my daughter, for about a half hour. I called it later on, I called it an interspecies play date. They were just having the time of their lives. They were somersaulting over each other, swimming around each other, just kind of playing, having a blast. And later on, Jenny became a marine biologist. And she tells us that she feels that the seed for that career was planted that afternoon in the Galapagos when she became a sea lion for a half hour. And it kind of changed her whole sense of reality and what's important in life and the possibilities. And so now she's a marine biologist, and it all goes back to that wonderful trip to the Galapagos.
What's wonderful, Don, listening to you and talking with you, is that you've done this for 40 years and you still have the same enthusiasm and the same excitement for faraway places and for your work. And when I was interviewing you before for the magazine, you did say one thing to me. You said, every journey is a pilgrimage. Mm-hmm. And that travelers need to learn the fine art of vulnerability. And I think you express that when you're talking about your life. And now, I mean, so here you are, you're a writer, you're traveling, going all these places, you're perfecting that art. Suddenly you're an editor, and then now you're a teacher. How you're back where you started from, except you're right. English as a second language this time. But how did that happen? How did you make that adjustment?
Well, I love teaching. in Japan, I love teaching. So I first really taught in Greece. That fellowship I had in Greece right after graduating from Princeton was a teaching fellowship at Athens College. So I was teaching English there. And then in Japan, I was teaching literature and writing and English, composition and conversation. I loved teaching. I didn't think it was a career I wanted to pursue, but I loved doing it. I loved the act of teaching, the dynamic of teaching. And so when I was the travel editor at the Examiner, after some years, I decided it would be fun to start teaching writing workshops. And I began offering one a year. And I did that for a few years. And then Book Passage and I got together and they said, why don't you, we have a budding sort of university program here. Why don't you start teaching with us? So I began teaching through Book Passage. And then, of course, the wonderful Elaine Petrocelli at Book Passage came to me one day and said, how about, I have this crazy idea. What if we did a multi-day conference for travel writers and travel photographers? And I loved that idea. And the saintly Jan Morris blessed us the very first year of the conference by coming and being our guest of honor. And so one thing kind of led to another, and teaching became part of my ongoing life. Now, in the past year, I used to only teach in person. And over the years, many people have asked me to teach online. And I always said, no, I don't think so. I really like the dynamic of being in person with people and seeing them around a table and just kind of interacting in that personal way. I don't think I could do that online. And for the past year, I've been teaching many workshops online, and I absolutely love it. And it's a lot more intimate than I realized. And it allows me to have students from Singapore and Paris and Thailand and all around the world who don't have to come to Corte Madera, California, to take my class. And so it's really opened up my world, expanded my horizons, and I love it. So I'm intending to go on teaching. And I feel like so many people have been great mentors to me in my life and have been so kind to me and generous to me and gotten me where I am. I feel like it's important to pass that on and to do that with people, for me to them. So I love teaching, and I think it's a really important part of my kind of gestalt, whoever I am in the world. Being a teacher is a big part of that, and I love it.
Yeah, and the writers that influenced you, I mean, you spoke about one who in particular.
Well, yeah, I mean, the great John McAfee, when I mentioned mentors, really my life changed with the great John McAfee, staff writer at the New Yorker since forever. I was a senior at Princeton in 1975, and that was the spring when John McAfee decided to teach a class at Princeton that's become absolutely legendary in the annals of journalism. It's called The Literature of Fact, but it was basically a nonfiction writing class. And he had, I think, 10 students. You had to apply to get accepted. It was spring of my senior year. And for all my years studying literature, I'd been taught to emulate poets and fiction writers and put them on pedestals. And then John McAfee came along and basically said, nonfiction writers belong on those pedestals too. And it was a whole new way of looking at the world for me as a writer. And I wrote my first nonfiction pieces in his class. I remember one of my first stories was on who invented the hole in the donut. And and it was great. It was liberating. It was super fun. And John McAfee was the consummate teacher and exemplar. And he would bring in editors from the New Yorker to talk to us. He'd bring in people that he profiled for his pieces. It was really an exhilarating immersion in the world of nonfiction writing. And he taught me that was something worthy of me, that being a nonfiction writer was just as good as being a great novelist or a great poet. And that definitely planted the seed that then got watered and replanted in Paris. And suddenly here I am 40 years later, a nonfiction writer all my life, a travel writer all my life. He was a great mentor and a great influence on me.
I'm an enormous fan of John McAfee's. It's something that John and I share, though I never had the privilege of meeting him. But what he does that's so remarkable, he's writing nonfiction, but he uses literary techniques and fiction techniques in it. They're very telling. And if there's anyone watching this who does not know John McAfee, do not walk to Book Passage, go online and order. I think Don and I both agree that the John McAfee readers are good ways to start. But I remember reading his first articles in the 60s, which really dates me somewhat too.
Mhm.
But
Well, he used to have the best, he still does in a way have the best job in the world. Was every year he would write one 70,000 word article for the New Yorker. And then Farrar Straus Giroux would turn it into a book. And that was it. That was his year. And then the next year he'd do another 70,000 word article for the New Yorker. And I remember thinking as an undergraduate, I would like to do that. That sounds like a good way to make a living to me.
yeah, and he painstakingly researches everything, which is important too. So these are important lessons you learned. And this is how your poetry, in a way, affects your work as a nonfiction writer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, one of the things that John McAfee taught us as undergraduates was that every single word counts. And one of my favorite assignments that he would give us was the old New Yorker had these front of the book Talk of the Town articles that were usually about 250 words long, written by incredibly great writers and edited by, at that time, like 10 New Yorker editors. And then they'd appear at 250 words, and he would give those to us and say, cut 10 words from this story. And we would all go, Professor McAfee, this has already been edited by 10 New Yorker editors. There's no way we can cut a word. But it made you stop and read, and every single word does this word to be here. And that was a great way to appreciate language and the value of every word. And of course, that really dovetailed with my poetry, where every word is important and has weight and has to have weight. So that became a part of my writing practice, I think, that notion that every word really has to count. And I keep asking myself, is this the right word? Is this the right word? Is this the right word? Can I say this better? Can I find one word instead of three here? And I think that's really important. Even in a 40,000 words, big, long story, every word still should count. And that's something I learned from poetry and from John McAfee, and I try to apply it now when I write as well.
Yeah, is it Mark Twain who said famously, whoever it was said it famously, I'm sorry, my piece is so long. If I had more time, I would have written shorter.
Exactly.
And, you really need to spend the time to hone it and work for every word. What other advice would you give to writers? I don't mean young, just writers in general. What other advice is
I guess I have two kind of poles of advice. One is don't give up. Believe in yourself, believe in your dreams, persevere. It's really, really important. John McAfee, I forget now what it was, but he had something like 75 rejection notes from the New Yorker before he got his first piece published. And that's John McAfee. So don't give up, believe in yourself. But then the other one I think is, and I always say this in my writing workshops, that you have to know your own point. What's the point of your story? What's the point of your piece? If you don't know the point of your piece, then there's no way the editor or the reader is going to know what the point of your piece is. So figure out what it is you want to say, what the point of your story is, and then figure out the best way to say that, and get rid of anything that doesn't contribute to that message, that theme, that point. Even if you had a wonderful dinner that you're dying to write about, if it's not part of the story that leads to that point, it's not part of your story for this point. Use it somewhere else. And I think that's just something that writers at all levels need to remember, just that their writing has to matter. There has to be some reason behind it, some point that they're trying to make that I can take away as a reader that makes me feel enriched and enhanced. Whether I'm going to go to the place they're writing about or not, it needs to enrich me as a human being and as a reader and as a traveler.
And I think by using the word story, you really summing up it. There has to be a story there. And as a newspaper reporter, a nonfiction writer, for a long time I was involved. I resented saying it's not a story, it's an article, it's factual. But then I began writing nonfiction using a lot of literary techniques. And I was at the University of Oregon State University with John Franklin, who has 2 single Pulitzer Prizes for literary nonfiction writing. I think it's called creative nonfiction. And he wrote a book called Writing for Story. And the point he made in his graduate classes all the time was, again, you're writing a story. And as you said, Don, there has to be a point, there has to be a place that you take us. So I think that's terrific advice. And I do sometimes see writers forget that. And particularly when you're writing about travel, there are service journalism, of course, where you want all the information. I do that a lot, but also I think you want to have a story, not just I went there and did that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was Paul Theroux who said, I don't want to read a summary, I want to read a story.
Oh.
And you know, some writers just kind of say, so this is what I did. I got up in the morning, I had a great breakfast, I went for a walk on the beach, I had an awesome lunch. And as a writer, that's really not okay. As a reader, I'm going, okay, and why are you telling me this? What are we leading up to here? What's the point? What's the point? What's the point? And I think that's just something that people need to remember. We don't want summaries. We want stories. We want to be the person around the campfire, enthralling everyone listening with something that's going to transport them and teach them and both give them essential good information, but also kind of enrich them in some deeper emotional, spiritual way. That's what I try to do with my travel writing.
Yeah, and I think you succeed. What I've thought about it at times, it's like being a scout. It's like, you know, going ahead on your pinto pony out into the thing, and then coming back and reporting, what did I see? What happened? What's going on? What's the story? So that's part of the job of a travel writer also, is to be the one who goes where they can't go and, you know, leads the way for other people to go, which I think is very important.
And one of the things I believe very fervently, following up on that, is that it's a report about what you experienced, but also about how it affected you. And this is something that feels very important to me as a travel writer, that for me, travel writing is, I always like to say, it's the record of two contemporaneous journeys, one into the world outside the writer and one into the world inside the writer, and how those two journeys influence each other and intersect with each other. And I think really, really great travel writing records both of those journeys and gives them both full expression, because it is what we experience, what we eat, smell, taste, touch is hugely interesting and educational, but also how that affects us inside and what we're thinking and feeling and how it changes us, how it transforms us. That's really, really important too. For me as a travel writer and for me as a reader of travel stories, I want that. I want that to be part of the story.
So along those lines, whenever you're choosing articles for a literary anthology, what are you looking for? Obviously, you're looking for that. Are you looking for something else? And maybe can you tell us about a couple of stories you chose that surprised you and opened your eyes, even as a seasoned travel writer and editor?
I think, well, I'm looking for that. I'm looking for stories that are the record of those two journeys, that show a transformational travel experience, that educate me, but also educate me about a place and a culture, but also about the human experience and the human journey in general. And one story that just always leaps to my mind was a really surprising story for me. One of the first anthology, when I was at Lonely Planet, I was the global travel editor at Lonely Planet for 6 or 7 years. It was a great job in all ways, but one of the great things I got to do was edit a literary travel anthology every year. And I would come up with a theme. And my favorite book I think of all is The Kindness of Strangers. That's been a defining theme of my whole life as a traveler. I'm a hapless traveler, constantly relying on the kindness of strangers. But I put that out to a lot of writers and got incredible stories. But the one that surprised me the most was the great chef Alice Waters at Chez Panisse, the person who transformed American cuisine. And she wrote this beautiful story about how when she was very, very young, traveling through Turkey with some friends, and they were out in the middle of nowhere, and they ran out of gas they happened to just get to a gas station where they ran out of gas, and they went into the gas station, and there was only a little boy there. And it seemed that he was there alone for the time being, and his parents were going to be back. And so first they said, "Is there any gas?" And he managed to indicate, "No, there's no gas, but my parents will be coming back and there'll be gas when they come back." And they said, "Okay, is it okay if we just wait here?" He said, "Yes." And then she was hungry. They hadn't eaten, and Alice Waters was hungry. And she said to the little boy, "Is there any food?" And he gravely said yes. And he went away, and he came back with a little plate. And on the little plate was a little piece of cheese. And he had very painstakingly cut the little piece of cheese into even littler pieces of cheese. And he offered that plate to the 4 travelers. And each traveler took a bite and ate, and they finished the cheese. And then Alice Waters says, to her sort of eternal remorse, she said, "Is there any more food?" And the little boy looked at her and shook his head, no, there was no more food. And she said in that moment, she realized that this little boy had given them the food that was meant to last him until his parents got back. And in just this incredible act of kindness and generosity and hospitality, he had given all of his food to them. And she said that really changed her life, that moment, that she understood hospitality in a whole new way. And she felt that that moment planted the seed for her to become the great chef and restaurateur that she is today. And she traced it all back to that moment in Turkey. Now, I remember as an editor getting that story and holding it in my hands and going, oh my God, I can't believe that I played a role in the birth of this story, that I'll get to publish this and share it with the world. This is incredible. And I get goosebumps even now thinking about it.
Yeah, I heard you tell it before. It still makes me tear up. It's so incredibly moving. And actually, your more recent book talks about the journeys one makes when one doesn't travel. And it's available free. How do we tell people how to get it? It's called Wonderlust in the Time of COVID.
Yeah, Wanderlust in the Time of Coronavirus. Dispatches from a year of traveling close to home. And it's a series of essays that I wrote for the Geographic Expeditions website, which is called Wanderlust, and which I edit. And so last year, when I wasn't able to travel, when hardly anyone was able to travel, I began writing about close to home adventures and how to keep my wanderlust alive and the things I was doing and what I was thinking. And GOX kindly collected these into an ebook. And the easiest way to tell people to get it is to go to my website, which is don-george.com. And there's a link right on the homepage of my website that will take you to a page where you can order the ebook. It's free. I'm really humbled and honored that GOX collected those pieces and produced this book. And for me, this year has been just an incredible revelation about how rich the Bay Area is, how rich my backyard is, the amazing sort of world-class treasures that are all around me that I usually don't get to see because I'm too busy exploring the world-class treasures on the other side of the planet. So I've got to do things this year that I hadn't done in 40 years in the Bay Area. And it's been a huge revelation and really kind of enlightening in all kinds of ways. I mean, lightening in the sense of lightening my soul as well. Certainly enlightening my mind, but kind of making my spirit lighter too.
But it talks also about the internal journeys that you did. And in one of them, it's cherry blossom time in Japan, where I think you were supposed to be. Instead, you went over to the Piedmont Park, and there were cherry blossoms. The cherry trees were in blossom, and you spread a blanket and you sat down and you enjoyed cherry blossom time, in this time and place.
I brought my sake bottle, and there I was in Piedmont Park, drinking sake and being Japanese. There was a moment under those cherry blossom boughs in Piedmont Park when I remember I looked up and there were the pink blossoms against the deep blue sky. And it was literally as if a little portal opened and I was suddenly transported back to Kyoto, where a year earlier, I'd been standing by the side of the philosopher's path in Kyoto, looking up at pink cherry blossoms against a deep blue sky. And somehow those two moments just came together. And for a moment in Piedmont Park, I could hear the murmurs of Japanese around me, and I could see the sellers of cherry blossom scented ice cream cones and cherry blossom scented lattes. And it was kind of all around me. People in kimono suddenly sort of appeared in my mind. And that was an amazing transformational moment where Piedmont and Kyoto, Piedmont and Kyoto kind of came together. And I realized that in a really important sense, Kyoto is inside me. Those cherry blossoms are inside me. I don't have to actually be standing on the philosopher's path to stand on the philosopher's path. I can do it in my mind. And in those moments in Piedmont Park, I really did. And that was pretty wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Do we have questions? Everybody, I'm going to go to the Zoom chat here thing and see if there are some questions. I know that there was one that someone asked earlier how poetry has informed his work, and I think Don spoke about that. And actually, I remember your response recently when I asked you if you still write poetry. And what was your response, Don?
I try to write poetry in the form of prose, but I think that I still write poetry. People often say, did you give up poetry? And what I've tried to do is write poetry in a prosaic way, but I think the attentiveness that I pay to words and to the space between the words. One of the things I love about poetry is it attends to the silence between words and the silence between lines. And I try to do that in my prose. So recently I've been incorporating more and more rhymes into my prose somehow. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. And so I think that I've never given up writing poetry. And it's still very much an important part of who I am and how I write and why I write. And so I feel lucky that I can actually do that. I've been lucky enough to be my editor most of my life. So I'm a very understanding editor, but I have some great other editors out there too who also are generous with my prose. And so I've been really, really lucky, I think, as a writer.
Well, it's also helped you get work to be your own editor. You can
It has, yeah, truly.
Someone asked if there was ever a time during your travels when you said no thanks, or a place you decided not to go. And that's in line with the next thing I want to ask, which is 90 countries. I mean, where haven't you been and what's next? So maybe those two are together. Are there places where you've just said, no, I don't think so? And where do you still want to go?
I can't actually think of any place I've ever said, no, I don't want to go there. Actually, I can't think of any place I've ever said, no, I don't want to go there. I think I have this incredibly naive sense that there's something wonderful to be discovered pretty much anywhere I go. The place I haven't written about ever that I went that was excruciatingly difficult was Calcutta. And part of it was just the framework of the trip. I'd been living in Japan. I flew on my summer vacation. I flew directly to Calcutta from Tokyo and got off the plane, from the pristine surrounds of Japan, where everybody's intensely aware of personal space, and you can be on a crowded subway and still feel like nobody's touching you and everyone's in their own little world. Then you get to Calcutta, where it's the exact opposite, where it's just an explosion of color and sound and smell and everything. Calcutta was a little bit overwhelming for me. I think my brain fried a little bit. And so I've never written about Calcutta. It was a really difficult transition for me to go from Tokyo to Calcutta. It was a difficult experience. I got out into other parts of India and loved it and had a wonderful time, but I've never written about Calcutta. Maybe I will one of these days, but that's the one place that comes to mind that I've just never found a way to write about.
Wow. Well, are there places you haven't been where you want to go still?
There are. I've never been to Bhutan. I'd love to go to Bhutan. Yeah, right. So I want to go to Bhutan. I've never been to Antarctica. I used to sort of very dumbly say that, well, Antarctica is just a big white expanse. And I'm not quite sure I see the interest in that, but a lot of people have come back and told me it's a very sacred place. It's an incredibly moving, poignant, transformational experience to be there in Antarctica. So that's now high on my list of places to go. And the number one experience on my list is to go gorilla trekking in Rwanda. I would really like to go up and meet my ancestors out in the jungle and spend an hour with them and just kind of hang out and have that communion. I've communed with elephants and I've communed with whales, and I'd really like to have that moment of communion with a gorilla. That would be a really special trip for me.
Well, two of those three are absolutely places I would love to go. And a couple of people are asking about when you're going to travel and where you're going to travel to, and are you leading tours? And I do know that you lead tours. Maybe you do one to Bhutan. I'll be on the list.
That's an idea.
Where are you going when you can travel again? I know so far your travels have been by car, as far as Santa Barbara,
right.
where the delicious grandchild is.
Yes, and that was fun. I'm supposed to go to Japan. I'm supposed to lead a trip for GOX to Japan in October, and we will see if that happens or not. But I have never been to Japan. 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 I have I've been traveling to Japan through my screen, viewing the Olympics, and that's been really exciting. But that's on my books. I'm leading a trip for GOX to Mexico in November, December. And this is actually breaking news. No one in the world knows this just about, but I just found out today that a trip I've been scheduled to lead to Switzerland and Italy for National Geographic is actually happening. And that's leaving on September 5th. So I found out today that I'm going to Switzerland in September. So that was very exciting news. So that's actually the first international trip I will have taken in 2 years. Is going to be to Switzerland in September. So that's exciting. So I've got Europe and Japan and Mexico on my radar for this year. I hope they all happen. And I'm excited to get back out in the world.
What about COVID though? I mean, what about the flying? Are you concerned about that? I know you're vaccinated and I'm vaccinated and all that. I'm flying next week and I'm a little nervous about it.
I'm concerned, but I think that if I travel smartly, everything will be fine. So I'm definitely concerned, and I'm going to do everything I can to be safe and follow all the protocols and do everything right. And I think I've been talking about spring training travel, which is what I've been doing recently, where I've been a tourist for the first time in Sonoma and what that felt like to kind of be a tourist again. And then I spent a couple of nights at the Sonoma Mission Inn to see what it would feel like to spend the night in a hotel again. And how do you check into a hotel? And how do you order room service and all these things that I've forgotten in 2 years? So I've been doing my spring training practice, and I think I'm ready for the real season to begin now. But I know I'll be super vigilant and careful. And I feel with being vaccinated that everything's going to be fine.
Yes, and I'm going to be careful as well. Someone had a kind of technical question to ask. They wanted to know how you keep your experiences in notes when you're traveling. How do you do notes as you go, or do you wait until you have time afterward? And
I have my notebook.
Oh, it's a pretty big notebook.
Which actually says notebook. So in case I forget what it is, this is my Japanese.
You don't have like a reporter's notebook or something?
No? I do have a reporter's notebook, but it's not nearly as fun as this one. So I have my notebook here, and it's a way for me I just jot down notes all the time as I'm going along, and I'll stop somewhere. I try, at least every other day, I try to take a half hour or an hour to stop and be in a market or be in a coffee shop or be somewhere where I can say, I'm just going to sit here and write. I'm going to write about the world right around me and what's happening in that world. And so I'll put my notes in, and then 3 weeks later or 3 months later, I'll read that passage, and it will sort of transport me back to that moment in that market or that coffee shop. And it brings it all back to life for me. So I use my journal very, very religiously in that way. I take lots of notes. I also use my phone as a recorder, a voice recorder. So I'll record conversations. I'll record notes sometimes in my phone. Recently, I've actually begun kind of writing stories verbally on my phone when I'm in places where it's difficult to sit down and write. So I use those tools, absolutely. And I use my phone as a camera to record things that I don't need to mess up my brain by trying to remember what something looks like. If I can take a picture of it, I free up a little brain space for that, other things. So that's what I do in the field to try to record what's happening to me in the moment. And I think it's really critically important to have those contemporaneous notes and photos and verbal snapshots, because they really help bring the trip back to you when you're not there anymore. Mm-hmm.
And I find it very useful to take pictures of things like signs and things, so you don't have to write them down and remember them. So then you've got that absolutely down too. With a thing.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
I'm looking to see if there are any more questions. I think that people have asked some of the same ones over again. So I think we need to summarize in a way. What have you learned from a life in travel that's important? You've talked about a lot of things, how it's affected your life, how your life is travel, how you've spoken very movingly and eloquently about travel and its role in your life. But what have you learned basically? What's the most important thing you've learned from travel?
That's a good question. I guess a few things come to mind. Some we've mentioned, like that cultivating the fine art of vulnerability. I do think that opening yourself up to the world is a super important thing to do for writers, but also just for travelers, to let a place kind of come into you, to get into a foreign place and not be closed and afraid and say, I'm just going to survive being here, but to go to a foreign place and open your arms up wide and say, here I am, take me, do with me what you will. I want to learn everything there is to learn about you. I think that's a good attitude to have. One of the things I learned early on that I keep learning over and over again, excuse me, is that whatever energy you put out into the world comes back to you 100-fold. So whatever it is you're sending out into the world will send it back to you in wave upon wave upon wave. And what that's meant for me is, if I travel with a sense of sort of appreciation and wonder and gratitude, the world embraces me and sends wonder back to me and sends kind of appreciation back to me, and places open up for me. And I have pretty great travel experiences because of that, I think. So much of it is what you bring to it, what you walk into the shop exuding. If it's enthusiasm and appreciation, you're going to be greeted with enthusiasm and appreciation. So I think that's really important. And of course, the commonality, the great human commonality that transcends social status and religious belief and economic background and really everything, that we're all human beings, essentially. I think we're basically caring about each other, kind to each other, friendly to each other. Fundamentally, on a really basic level, I think most human beings care about most other human beings, that the planet is a friendly place, and that people will take care of you when you need it, and that you will take care of people when they need it. And I've learned that over and over and over again in my travels. And so I think that the fact that travel can contribute to a sense of understanding and appreciation, respect, that when you travel, you learn that there are all these multiple myriad mosaic pieces on the planet, and that each one is precious and important, needs to be cherished and needs to be preserved. I think that's been a huge lesson for me. And I feel that in a way I've become a travel evangelist because of that. But I think really travel is kind of my religion, because I think that travel paves the pathway to peace and understanding around the globe. And so it has become my religion in a way, because I think that what we're ultimately trying to do on this planet is take care of each other, make the world a better place, make our human lives better. And I think travel really does that. It enriches us and it connects us and it makes us bigger, broader human beings. And that's what I try to do as a writer, as an editor, as a traveler. And every time I make a little tiny, humble step in that direction, I get the feedback that that's really important, that's really good, keep doing it. And so I've just kept doing it and kept doing it and kept doing it for 40 years. And I'm not going to give up. It's my little pilgrimage, and I love it.
Don, that's wonderful. It's a wonderful way to conclude our conversation. And it's been marvelous speaking to you. Every time I speak to you, I learn something else. And as I said, what's so impressive to me is your real enthusiasm, not just for what you do, but for the world and your hopes for the world. So thank you very, very much. We greatly appreciate it. And
Thank you, Judith.
This will be available as a recording for people to play in case you missed some. And Don, I hope to see you around the hood.
I hope to see you around the hood too. It's been a super honor and pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the gift of your presence, dear. Okay, bye.
Bye.